Hey everybody, welcome to the Gospel of John study. This is chapter 2. We're carrying on. We've been going about 3 months, just taking it verse by verse as we go through there. We had some problems recording it on the day of the Bible study, so I'm just going back today in my office, just kind of giving you some of the highlights there. It probably won't be about a 30-minute Bible study, especially since we don't have people in the room just to have some discussion there. So just want to go over it with you. But if you have your Bible, you want to head, go and grab it and turn to John chapter 2. That's where we're going to be this morning. I'm going to break this chapter into 2 different parts. Hopefully you have an outline. If you don't, let me know. We'll get you one. You can follow that along with the video as well. So, all right, John chapter 2, starting in verse 1 here. John says, "On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, 'They have no more wine.' 'Dear woman, why do you involve me?' Jesus replied, 'My time has not yet come.' His mother said to the servants, 'Do whatever he tells you.' Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, 'Fill the jars with water.' So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, 'Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet.' They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants had drawn the water new. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, 'Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine as the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best for last.' This is the first of his miraculous signs Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him." All right, that stops right there at verse 11. So let's just go over a couple things here that I want to point out to you. In the Gospel of John, we talked about this last month too. John refers to the miracles of Jesus as signs. Signs of his power, signs of his authority, signs of who Jesus was. That's one of the main points in the Gospel of John, is for those who read it, who would believe in Jesus Christ. I think we mentioned this the first week too. The word believe is used 95 times in the Gospel of John, and elsewhere in the New Testament, a total of like 150 times. So very, very much so here is a major theme of belief in the Gospel of John. So a couple of things I want to point out to you. It mentions there that Jesus' mother and he and his disciples were all invited to this wedding. So a lot of people think it was probably maybe a close family friend or something like that, or it could have been a relative of Jesus and Mary as well too. So they were invited to this wedding. A wedding back in the biblical time was not like we would have today, where it may go all day long or several hours. A Jewish wedding in the first century could go all day. Many of them lasted a week long. People would celebrate, that celebration of a wedding. So just something to keep in mind there. In verse 4, this is the first thing I want to point out. When Mary comes to Jesus with the problem, "Hey, we've ran out of wine," Jesus' response to her in verse 4, he says, "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" I love what some of the commentators have said about this verse. It sounds kind of harsh, and in fact, in my NIV translation, the translators add the word "dear" there, even though it's not in the Greek. If you go to the Greek text that we have, the manuscript copies, the word "dear" is not there, but it's meant to soften this idea of Jesus saying, "Woman, why do you involve me?" A lot of people would think, well, that's kind of harsh. Well, in biblical times, that was kind of even a slight term of endearment. It's if you're from the South, it's kind of like the equivalent of saying "ma'am," right? As one commentator told me, that it's very soft. It's not meant to be abrasive, like many of us might think today if you just called somebody woman. So "dear woman" just kind of makes the distinction there. Although many of the commentators did note that a loving son would not refer to his mother as woman. But I think what we've got going here, we'll see here in just a minute, there's a change of authority going on here. There's a lot about authority in this chapter 2, we'll see. But the thing about Jesus grew up. He was raised by Mary and Joseph, was obedient, and Luke tells us he grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men. Well, now that he's begun his earthly ministry, the authority has changed. Jesus is God's son. He is God incarnate. And so we see the way that he's speaking to Mary. It's not ugly or harsh, but it's with authority. And so he's saying, why do you involve me? This is a Jewish idiom, and it's almost the equivalent of saying, what does this have to do with me and you? You know, Jesus is like, it's not yet my time here. So that phrase, Jesus responds in verse 4, my time has not yet come. Sometimes that the Greek word for time is also translated hour. In fact, several times in the Gospel of John, we see Jesus saying the same phrase, my hour has not yet come, my time has not come. It's found in John chapter 7, verse 30, John chapter 8, verse 20, John 12, 23, and verse 27 again, John 13, 1, and then John 17, 1. So several times Jesus sees this, my time is not yet come. In the other instances there in John, when he says that, he is definitely referring to his crucifixion, the time where he would go to the cross. Here, we're not yet sure, okay, is Jesus referring to his crucifixion or maybe the start of his ministry, because this was the first sign that Jesus performed. So maybe he was trying to push back a little bit there. So, but this is definitely this issue of authority here. I love this simple statement of faith here in verse 5. It's like Jesus and Mary having this conversation, and then verse 5 it says, his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. It's like Jesus is like, hey, don't bother me with this, woman. What does this have to do with me and you? And Mary just walks off and says, hey, servants, do whatever he says. That is a statement of faith, right? Mary's not sure how Jesus is going to solve the problem, but she knows that he is, right? So that's think about that statement of faith for you and I. We know God is working in our lives, in our families' lives, the church, but we don't know how he may answer, how may he respond. So just think about that for just a minute here. I love that. Do whatever he tells you there. All right. So next you see in some of the next couple of verses here, these ceremonial jars come into play for the ceremonial washing that was done. Jesus tells these servants, fill the jars with water. They were stone jars. They were made out of stone. According to the description, they could hold anywhere from 20 to 30 gallons. So you're looking at maybe anywhere from like 100 to 150 gallons of water. That's a lot of water that these servants had to fill up these ceremonial washing jars. Now, the ceremonial washing jars, what's that about? The scripture tells us, and we learn from Jewish history, that the Jews would wash their hands in the water. They would wash their utensils and take care of things. If you go to Mark chapter 7, verse 3 and 4, we get another glimpse of what some of these jars were used for. Let me read it to you real quick. Here's Mark 7, verse 3 and 4. When I find it, there it is. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they also observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So these jars, these stone jars, were used for washing of hands and to clean the dishes, if you will. Think about that for a minute. Jesus is going to use these stone jars, probably not the most clean things there. They probably collect the water from the well and just pour it down in there. And Jesus is taking this water and no telling, after somebody washes their hands, what kind of stuff is in that jar and falls to the bottom and all that. And here these servants are dipping out of this jar and taking it to the master of the banquet. You'd think like, yeah. I guess the modern day equivalent would be, imagine filling up your sink where you wash dishes, stopping it up, filling it with water, and then dipping water out of that and taking it to somebody for them to drink. You know, like, okay, I don't know about that, right? Unless you really clean that sink really, really good, right? So according to the text here, they had to fill the jars. The servants fill it to the brim. I don't know if there's something there. They're like, okay, we're going to be obedient, but we're going to go all the way. We're going to be obedient completely there. So Jesus takes some of this and draws it out. In verse 8, it says they take it to the master of the banquet there. This to me is a step of obedience, right? Imagine being one of the servants or being in the party here, and they're thinking, Jesus, what are you doing? Why did we fill this water? Now we're dipping it out of here. We're going to take it to the guy to taste. Am I going to get in trouble if I'm the one carrying the water for the man to taste? All sorts of things. But even though they didn't know what Jesus was doing, they were obedient. So that's a key thing here. This is a step of obedience right here. The last thing I want to point out to you in this section is in verse 11. It says, this is the first miraculous signs Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory. Now, the word glory in English can have a lot of different meanings, connotations. We talked about honor and worship and all that. But here, I think the word glory, the way it's used, is talking about Jesus's power and how it's used. He revealed his power there. Think about that. And then we see the results there in the last part of verse 11. It says that he thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. When God shows up, when God reveals his glory, his power, when we see his power in action, it causes us to place our faith and trust in him. So, all right, that's the first part. Hope you get all that. Hope you understand that. And now we're going to move on to the next section in John chapter 2, verses 12 through 25. Let me read that to you, and then we'll get back into it and talk about it. So, all right, starting in verse 12. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples. They stayed there for a few days. While it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Then the Jews demanded of him, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the miraculous signs he was doing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. He did not need men's testimony about man, for he knew what was in a man. All right, we'll stop right there. May God bless the reading of his word. So this next section here is where Jesus goes and he flips the tables over here in the temple. I have a question for you. How many times did Jesus cleanse the temple? The reason why I'm asking that is if you look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, John is the only Gospel that has Jesus flipping the tables over at the beginning of his Gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have Jesus doing this at the end of his ministry as he goes into the final week of his, before the Passover, before he goes to the cross and his crucifixion. So some people will say, did Jesus do this 2 times, one at the beginning of his ministry and one at the end, or was it just 1 time? And a lot of times people will look at a lot of different things. We do understand that the Gospels, many of them are not written in chronological order. John is especially one of those that takes things out of chronological order. We talked about the signs before that John used, the 7 signs are in the Gospel of John. John seems to kind of ramp up the seven signs, they increase each time we talk about them, and leading up to the seventh sign in John chapter 11, which is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. So that's pretty big, pretty intense. So a lot of people think possibly Jesus could have only flipped the tables over one time, but John chose to put this at the front of his gospel just to kind of make a point, especially speaking about his authority there. Is it one time? Is it two times? I'll leave that up for you to decide. There's a lot in there. There's some great discussion. If you read all four of the Gospels and you read the events there, there's some similarities there that makes me think that it is maybe one time. But many real conservative theologians will say, no, it was two times. Doesn't matter. We just know Jesus flipped the temple tables over there. So let's just go with that. So we do understand that the Gospels sometimes, especially, are out of order. Matthew wrote his Gospel to the Jews so that they would understand who Jesus was from a Jewish perspective, from the history of the Old Testament, especially with the book of Exodus and Matthew. There's so many correlations there between those two books of the Bible. The Gospel of Mark is an active gospel. Things move very fast, and Luke, it's funny, most people think Luke, he doesn't know much. He wasn't one of the original 12, but we've really soon discovered that Luke's gospel is very detailed, very concise, and a lot of people love his work as well too. So, all right, another note here. According to the Gospel of John, we know that there were at least 3 Passovers during the time of Jesus' ministries. And there's possibly a fourth. 3 times in the Gospel of John alone are 3 different Passovers mentioned. There's one in John chapter 2 where we're reading today. There's another one in John chapter 6 and another in John chapter 11. The fourth one is John chapter 5, verse 1. It talks about a Jewish festival, but it doesn't name the Passover by name, so we're not sure if that's the Passover or another one. But I want to bring that up to you because it tells us a couple of different things. Number one, many of you probably have heard this, that Jesus' ministry was somewhere between 2 to 3 years. Well, this kind of gives us a clue and gives us a hint to know that this gave a timeline. If there was a Passover at the beginning of his ministry and then one at the end and one somewhere in the middle, that would give you that 2 to 3 year timeline. So that's kind of interesting to note there. So, but we have 3 Passovers that are specifically talked about in the Gospel of John alone. So, all right. So the Bible says here in this section that Jesus crafted a whip. He went after these pieces of cordage and put it together. You can imagine he's just walking around looking for ingredients, if you will, to put this whip together. And then he goes to work by driving the people out of there. It's like, whoa, okay. It's interesting, too, in this passage in John, there's no mention of like evil or moral ills that are being done. In the other Gospels you read, the texts say that, Jesus said something like, you have made my temple, my Father's house, into a den of robbers. So there's some bad things going on there. Here in the Gospel of John, it only says that you've made my Father's house into a market. So it's a little less harsh, if you will, compared to the other versions in the other different Gospels there. So just something to consider here. This really is getting at, what should the temple, what should the church today be about? What is true worship? Should we have all these excess things in our church? Should we have the coffee bar with all the snacks and people bringing that into the sanctuary and eating it and drinking it while church is going on? I think it's a good time for us to reflect and think about, how much we consider, what worship is and what it's not, and what should be involved in church and not. So just important to think about that as well. Then it says the disciples here in verse 17 recall something from the Old Testament that it comes from Psalm chapter 69, verse 9. And it says, zeal for your house will consume me. So there's a messianic prophecy in the Old Testament in Psalm chapter 69, which is a Psalm of David. And his disciples say, oh, this is just like what was talked about in the Old Testament is a prophecy. So they're equating, they're putting things together with who the Messiah was prophesied about with what Jesus is doing now, right there in front of them. So, all right. The Jews confront Jesus when he flips over the tables and does all this, and they come to him with this question: by what authority are you doing these things? They're confronting him on his authority. They come to him and they demand that they be given a sign, so that, hey, prove to us that you're doing what you're doing is from God. So right there in verse 18, what miraculous signs can you show us to prove your authority? This is where Jesus mentions destroying the temple and that he would raise it up in 3 days and build it back again. He says, I will raise it again in 3 days. This passage right here is also used in the Gospels later, or this event is used later in the Gospels when the people come to falsely accuse Jesus at his trials before he is crucified, and he's standing before the religious leaders. These, if you'll remember, the false witnesses. This is in Mark chapter 14, verse 58, and Mark 15:29. They come to the religious leaders and say, he said he was going to destroy the temple. So they're trying to use this to get Jesus in trouble, but that's not exactly what Jesus said. If you go back and look at the text here, Jesus said he was not going to destroy the temple. He told them that they were going to destroy the temple. We'll talk about what the temple is in just a minute. But look again at verse 19. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. See, Jesus never said anything about him destroying the temple himself. In the Greek, that's actually Jesus pointing to them, saying, you destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it again. So you got to be careful. You got to think about those words right there. Now, we know from the text here, the disciples put 2 and 2 together. He's not talking about the physical temple there that Herod built, but his body, according to what the text says there. So it's interesting. The Jews kind of kick back and say, what? It's taken 46 years to build this. By the time that this took place in the probably the 30 AD here, or late 29 or so AD, we know from history that Herod's temple was not finished really until about 64 AD. But at this point, it had taken 46 years to build the temple to this point. We do know from history that Herod the Great started work on the temple in 19 BC. So you can kind of do the math and kind of figure out about what time this is, 46 years or so later. It's pretty interesting. So, but at this time, they had thought they had finished the temple, right? So don't let that sidetrack you if people say, well, Jesus said that, or the Bible says the temple was finished here, but we know from history it wasn't finished till 64 AD. Think about your house. You move in, you settle a house, right? You get everything placed just where you want it. You hang the pictures up, put the furniture around, but then maybe a month or two later, you come back and you add something, right? You change things up. And so if we think about that, that's probably what happened with Herod's temple. They finished it at that point when Jesus was talking to them, but they continued to add adornments and make things in addition to what they've already done. So that's kind of what to look at there. Verse 22 says, after he was raised from the dead, the disciples' light bulb came on and they understood what he was talking about there. What Jesus is saying here in both the water to wine miracle and then both here now and also in the flipping over the tables, Jesus is saying, hey, I'm the new wine. I'm the greater wine. That the other stuff you had, wait till you taste this. And then here, Jesus is saying also, just as the temple was there, the place where God resided, right? That people would go offer their sacrifices, go to worship. Jesus is saying, I am the new temple. When he said, destroy this temple, meaning himself, and 3 days later, I will raise it again. So in both of these passages here in John chapter 2, Jesus is replacing the old, outdated, with the new, much better. So that's kind of cool to think about there as well. So Jesus is the new temple here where God dwelt. He is God incarnate, right? All right, Jesus, it says in the last part of chapter 2 here that he performed some other miracles. It doesn't list them by name, but it says that also that the people there believed in him. And in the last two verses here, I just want to read these to you again, verse 23, 24, and 25. There's a little bit of some irony going on here. Let me read it to you again. Starting in verse 23. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many saw the miraculous signs he was doing and believed in his name. Verse 24, but Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. He did not need man's testimony about man, for he knew what was in a man. So here the people put their trust and believed in him, but Jesus would not entrust himself to them. So that's kind of a play on words, if you will. Maybe it's sometimes we use irony all the time, and it's not really irony, but it's more of a play on words, actually. But they believed and trusted in him, but yet he would not place his trust in them, probably knowing that maybe some of these same people who believed on him might be the ones that would turn on him later and not believe, and then walk away because of things that were happening there. So maybe that's kind of an influence there. All right, well, that's kind of John chapter 2 in a nutshell. Let me just go over a couple of principles and applications that we see here, things that would, what can we pull out of this for our lives today, right? First thing, I mentioned some of these already, is the new wine and the new temple, right? Jesus in both of these passages was saying he is the new wine, the best wine. He is the new temple where God resides. And he was talking about himself. So, but just a point for us today. Hey, for you and I, when we place our faith and our trust in Jesus, we can experience that new life for ourselves as well. There is something greater in life than what we have now and what we're going through, right? All right. Secondly, just want to point out this connection here of faith and obedience. You see, Mary had told the servants, hey, do whatever Jesus tells you to do. I don't know what he's going to do, but just do it. And these servants, think about it, they could have gotten in trouble if they had dipped the water out of these ceremonial jars, taken it to the head master of the banquet, and he's like, what are you giving me this nasty water for? He could have gotten mad at them or fired them or whatever, right? But they simply trusted Jesus and did whatever he said. They obeyed what he said, and they got to be a part of that miracle, the first miracle that we have recorded here in the Gospel of John. So think about that for us too. You and I cannot see the great things that God wants to do working in our lives, doing things in our family, our church life, unless we have faith and unless we follow through with obedience. So I don't know what you're going through right now, things that you might be, struggling to trust the Lord in. But I just want to encourage you, if you know God has spoken and told you to do something or to go a certain direction or whatever it is, faithfully trust him and just let your obedience bring that blessing into your life, right? All right, last thing, I'll just share the last principle I want to look at here is this idea of what true worship is. And I already mentioned this earlier too, right? Jesus was righteously angry at what had happened to the temple, his father's house. The things that were going on there were not what the temple was for. We know from history that a long time before Jesus' day in the first century, they would sell these animals outside the temple. The text tells us outside in the Kidron Valley, across the valley on the other side. But as time goes, just like with many things, we get comfortable. We kind of get too comfy in some things, and then we start to let things slide. The Jewish people had these things outside the temple, but now they brought them into the temple. Because we're all here, might as well make it a convenience thing. And they really lost sight of what the temple was for. And so all I want to share is for you and I, when it comes to our worship practices, I think we all need to examine for ourselves, what am I doing? How am I preparing for worship? Are there things that I could do to focus more on the Lord? Do we come into the sanctuary and we're talking with people and cutting up and laughing and having a good time, when maybe we should have a little bit of quiet solitude and pray and say, God, I'm here this morning. I want to hear from you. Speak to me through the music or the message. And maybe we need to evaluate our own worship practices and make sure there's nothing in our lives or our church life that maybe we should cut out, because that's not what God would want, or it's not God honoring. So, all right. Well, that's kind of the John chapter 2 in a nutshell. On your outline there, you see some of these pictures, things like that. That's pretty interesting. That's on that third page there. You see that's an actual inscription in the wall that separated the Gentiles from the Jews that we have. The inscription reads, "No person of another race may enter within the barrier around the temple and its surrounding enclosure. Whoever is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his own ensuing death." So, yikes. That was an actual piece of Herod's temple that was found first century, dated back then. So it's just a piece of history. This is exactly what you kind of see going on here in the temple. It was divided up and amongst these different areas. You see also there, you've got the diagram of the temple and what it looked like. Interesting, the Herod the Great's temple that we're looking at and talking about today, which was there during Jesus' ministry, was so much larger than the other original temple and the tabernacle that we know about in the Old Testament. The original kind of area there was the original size of the temple in Solomon's day, and Herod just expanded on it. You can go to Jerusalem today and you can see the what's left of this temple and some of these big rocks that are around there. It's pretty fascinating, so it's exciting there. So, all right, well, God bless you guys. Hope you got something out of the Bible study today, and we will see you again next month in April for John chapter 3. All right, God bless. Y'all have a great day.